Before history learned to write its own name, before monuments rose from stone and kings ruled by divine decree, a river was already shaping the fate of humanity. It flowed silently through the heart of Africa, carving life from desert and order from chaos. This river was the Nile. At dawn, its waters glow with the soft fire of the rising sun. At dusk, it becomes a mirror for the stars, reflecting the same heavens once studied by ancient priests and astronomers. For thousands of years, the Nile has moved northward with unwavering patience, indifferent to empires yet essential to their existence. The Nile is not merely a river. It is a pulse, steady, rhythmic, and eternal. It carried fertile soil to barren lands, turning sand into sustenance. It offered a predictable rhythm in a world ruled by uncertainty, allowing humanity to settle, to farm, to build, and to dream beyond survival. Along its banks, time slowed, traditions took root, and civilization found permanence. To ancient peoples, the Nile was a living force, both generous and feared. Its floods meant life, its absence meant famine. It shaped calendars, inspired gods, and defined the boundary between life and death. The river became a sacred contract between nature and humanity, one that demanded respect, balance, and reverence. Even today, as modern cities rise and concrete dams restrain its flow, the Nile remains a witness to humanity's journey. It remembers what we forget. It carries the echoes of prayers, the shadows of temples, and the quiet footsteps of civilizations long gone. This is the story of the Nile, an eternal flow that transformed geography into destiny and water into history. The Nile River stretches more than 6,600 kilometers, making it one of the longest river systems on Earth. Its journey begins deep within the African continent and ends at the Mediterranean Sea, crossing 11 modern nations and countless landscapes along the way. Few rivers on the planet connect such vast ecological, cultural, and geographical diversity. The Nile is formed by two primary tributaries, the White Nile and the Blue Nile. Though united in name, their characters are profoundly different. The White Nile originates in the Great Lakes region of Central Africa, with its farthest headwaters traced to the highlands of Burundi and its most famous source at Lake Victoria. From there, it flows steadily through Uganda and South Sudan, passing through massive wetlands such as the Sud, where waters spread and slow, filtering and stabilizing the river's flow. The Blue Nile rises in the Ethiopian highlands near Lake Tana, a region shaped by volcanic activity and seasonal monsoon rains. Though shorter than the White Nile, the Blue Nile is far more dramatic and powerful. Each summer, heavy rains transform it into a raging current, carrying dark, mineral-rich silt downstream. This silt would eventually fertilize ancient farmlands and sustain entire civilizations. The two rivers meet near Khartoum, Sudan, forming the Nile proper. From this point onward, the river flows north through one of the driest regions on Earth. It cuts a narrow green corridor through vast deserts, creating a sharp contrast between life and lifelessness. Without the Nile, this region would be nearly uninhabitable. As the river approaches the Mediterranean, it fans outward into the Nile Delta, a vast triangular plain of rich soil built from millennia of deposited sediment. This delta became one of the most fertile agricultural regions in the ancient world and the foundation of Egypt's prosperity. Geographically, the Nile is an anomaly, a river that flows north across deserts, sustained by distant rains. Its origins lie far from the lands it nurtured, a reminder that civilizations often depend on forces they cannot see, only trust. The Nile River is not only a product of history, but of deep geological time. Its course was shaped over millions of years by tectonic forces, volcanic eruptions, erosion, and shifting climates, processes far older than human memory. At the heart of the Nile's formation lies the African tectonic plate. Slow but powerful movements within the Earth's crust lifted vast regions of eastern Africa, giving rise to the Ethiopian highlands and the East African plateau. These uplifts created steep gradients that allowed rivers to gather strength and carve enduring paths across the continent. Volcanic activity enriched the highlands with mineral-heavy soils, later carried downstream by seasonal rains. The Blue Nile and Atbara rivers owe their existence to this elevated terrain. During monsoon seasons, rainfall over the Ethiopian highlands funnels into these rivers, driving massive surges of water and sediment northward. Over time, this constant erosion sculpted deep valleys and transported fertile silt across thousands of kilometers. In contrast, the White Nile reflects a far older and more stable geological history. Its path winds through ancient rock formations and broad, flat basins. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Sud wetlands of South Sudan, one of the largest swamps on Earth. Here, the river spreads into countless channels, slowing its flow and acting as a natural regulator, smoothing seasonal extremes before the water continues north. As the Nile flows through Sudan and Egypt, it enters a landscape shaped by erosion rather than uplift. Limestone and sandstone cliffs rise along the riverbanks, forming a narrow valley that confined the river and protected early settlements. Over millennia, the Nile deposited layers of sediment, gradually building the fertile floodplain that would sustain agriculture and urban life. Remarkably, the Nile survived dramatic climatic shifts that turned much of North Africa into desert. While other ancient rivers vanished, the Nile endured, fed by distant rainfall beyond the desert's reach. Its persistence is a rare geological accident, one that transformed an arid corridor into the backbone of civilization. For ancient societies along its banks, the Nile was not governed by clocks or calendars, but by seasons written in water. The river's annual flood was the defining event of life in ancient Egypt, a natural rhythm that dictated survival, prosperity, and belief. Each year, during the summer months, monsoon rains swept across the Ethiopian highlands. These rains caused the Blue Nile and Atbara River to swell dramatically, sending torrents of water and nutrient-rich silt downstream. Weeks later, the floodwaters reached Egypt, rising steadily and spilling over the riverbanks. This inundation transformed the land. Dry, cracked soil disappeared beneath shallow water, and when the flood receded, it left behind a thin layer of fertile black mud. This natural fertilization eliminated the need for artificial soil enrichment and allowed crops to flourish with remarkable consistency. Grain harvests fed cities, supported artisans, and sustained monumental construction projects. The ancient Egyptians organized their entire year around this cycle. They divided time into 3 seasons: Akhet, the season of flooding; Pere, the season of growth; and Shemu, the season of harvest. Religious ceremonies, taxation, and agricultural planning were all synchronized with the river's behavior. The predictability of the flood shaped Egyptian worldview. Unlike societies plagued by erratic rainfall, Egypt experienced nature as orderly and dependable. This reinforced beliefs in cosmic balance, or Ma'at, and strengthened the idea that harmony between humans, gods, and nature was achievable. Yet, the flood was not always gentle. Too little water meant famine. Too much meant destruction. Priests monitored the river using nilometers, measuring flood levels to anticipate abundance or hardship. In the modern era, dams have largely ended the natural flood cycle. While this brought stability and control, it also severed a relationship between people and river that had endured for thousands of years, one that once defined the very meaning of time itself. Flowing across deserts, wetlands, and fertile plains, the Nile creates a chain of life that contrasts sharply with the arid lands surrounding it. The river's basin supports one of Africa's most diverse ecosystems, shaped by water, seasonal change, and human interaction over thousands of years. Along the riverbanks, lush vegetation flourishes where water reaches the soil. Papyrus reeds once grew in dense stands, especially in the delta and marshlands. More than a plant, papyrus became a foundation of civilization, used for boats, mats, baskets, and, most famously, as the writing material that preserved laws, prayers, and history. Lotus flowers bloomed along calm stretches of the river, symbolizing rebirth and the cycle of life in ancient Egyptian belief. Acacia trees lined parts of the Nile Valley, providing shade, timber, and resin. Date palms offered nourishment and building material, while reeds stabilized riverbanks and created habitats for wildlife. The Nile's waters teemed with fish, forming a vital food source from prehistoric times onward. Fishing techniques evolved from simple nets and traps to organized industries supporting urban populations. Fish also carried religious meaning, associated with both fertility and the underworld. Among the river's most iconic inhabitants were the Nile crocodile and the hippopotamus. Crocodiles inspired both fear and worship, embodied in the god Sobek, protector and destroyer. Hippopotamuses, powerful and unpredictable, symbolized chaos and untamed strength. Birds thrived along the river, including ibis, herons, and migratory species that used the Nile as a vital corridor between continents. Over centuries, human expansion altered these ecosystems. Wetlands were drained, species declined, and natural balances shifted. Yet even today, the Nile remains a living artery of biodiversity, a reminder that civilization did not conquer nature here, but emerged from it. No river in human history is more closely bound to the rise of civilization than the Nile. Long before dynasties were crowned and pyramids pierced the sky, early communities gathered along its banks, drawn by water, fertile soil, and the promise of stability. In an otherwise harsh and unforgiving environment, the Nile offered predictability. Its annual flood renewed the land, allowing agriculture to flourish without complex irrigation systems. Surpluses of grain freed portions of the population from subsistence farming, enabling the rise of craftsmen, priests, administrators, and rulers. This economic foundation made complex society possible. The river shaped settlement patterns. Villages and towns developed in linear fashion along the Nile's narrow floodplain, creating a natural north-south axis. The river became Egypt's primary transportation route, far more efficient than overland travel through desert terrain. Boats carried stone blocks for temples and pyramids, grain for trade, and soldiers for military campaigns. In this way, the Nile unified the land politically and culturally. The concept of kingship itself was tied to the river. Pharaohs were seen as divine intermediaries responsible for maintaining harmony between gods, people, and nature. A successful flood was interpreted as a sign of rightful rule. Failure could undermine a ruler's legitimacy. The Nile thus reinforced political authority through natural order. Religion, too, was inseparable from the river. Deities embodied its forces, and myths mirrored its cycles. Osiris, god of resurrection, was associated with the fertile silt that brought life after death-like drought. The journey of the sun god Ra across the sky was reflected in daily movement along the river. Burial practices aligned tombs with the West Bank, symbolizing the land of the dead, while life flourished on the east. Monumental architecture rose from Nile-fed prosperity. Pyramids, temples, and obelisks required immense resources, organization, and labor, made possible only by agricultural abundance and centralized control. These structures were not merely displays of power, they were expressions of cosmic order, permanence, and humanity's relationship with eternity. Beyond Egypt, the Nile nurtured other civilizations. Nubian kingdoms such as Kerma, Napata, and Meroe thrived along its southern reaches, engaging in trade, cultural exchange, and at times military conflict with Egypt. Gold, ivory, incense, and ideas flowed along the river, linking Africa's interior to the Mediterranean world. The Nile did not simply support civilization, it shaped its character. It fostered a worldview rooted in balance, continuity, and respect for natural cycles. While other societies rose and fell with unpredictable climates, The Nile allowed a civilization to endure for millennia, anchored by water that arrived faithfully, year after year. In the story of ancient humanity, the Nile stands not as a backdrop, but as a central actor, a silent architect of one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. For the civilizations that lived along its banks, the Nile was not simply a river. It was a sacred presence woven into every aspect of belief, identity, and meaning. Its predictable cycles of flooding and renewal inspired a spiritual worldview rooted in balance, continuity, and divine order. The ancient Egyptians personified the Nile as the god Hapi, the embodiment of abundance and fertility. Hapi was neither male nor female in form, symbolizing completeness and unity. Offerings were made to him at the onset of the flood, prayers spoken to ensure the waters would rise neither too little nor too much. A favorable flood was seen as a blessing from the gods, a confirmation that harmony between the heavens and the earth remained intact. The river was deeply intertwined with the mythology of death and rebirth. Osiris, god of resurrection and the afterlife, was closely associated with the fertile black silt left behind by the flood. Just as Osiris was reborn after death, the land itself was reborn each year beneath the Nile's waters. This cycle shaped Egyptian beliefs about immortality, inspiring elaborate burial practices and monumental tombs designed to ensure eternal life. The Nile also structured sacred geography. The East Bank, where the sun rose, symbolized life and renewal, while the West Bank, where the sun set, became the realm of the dead. Temples stood among the living, while tombs and pyramids were placed across the river, mirroring the cosmic journey of the sun god Ra through the sky and the underworld. Festivals celebrated the arrival of the flood, uniting agriculture, religion, and community. Music, offerings, and rituals transformed the natural event into a sacred celebration of survival and gratitude. Even the measurement of the river using nilometers carried spiritual weight, blending science with prophecy and divine interpretation. Beyond Egypt, the Nile held cultural significance for Nubian societies, where kingship, ritual, and landscape were similarly bound to the river's flow. Across regions and centuries, the Nile remained a shared symbol of life's fragile dependence on water. In essence, the Nile was a living scripture, its waters teaching generations that life, death, and renewal were not separate events, but parts of a single, eternal cycle. For much of human history, the origins of the Nile were among the greatest geographical mysteries of the ancient world. While its lower reaches were well known, its distant beginnings lay hidden beyond deserts, mountains, and uncharted territories. Ancient Egyptian texts offered little detail about the river's source, viewing it as a divine mystery rather than a physical question. Greek historians, including Herodotus, speculated widely, proposing theories ranging from melting snow to underground oceans. Roman expeditions attempted to follow the river southward, but were halted by impassable swamps and hostile terrain. The mystery endured for centuries until the age of European exploration in the 19th century. Driven by imperial ambition and scientific curiosity, explorers ventured deep into Africa, often facing disease, extreme climate, and conflict. Among the most famous were Richard Francis Burton and John Hanning Speke, whose partnership turned into rivalry. In 1858, Speke identified Lake Victoria as the source of the White Nile, arguing that its vast waters fed the river flowing northward. Burton, unconvinced, disputed the claim, igniting a public debate that captured global attention. Subsequent expeditions confirmed Speke's conclusion, though the precise farthest headwaters continued to be refined. Later explorations revealed the role of the Ethiopian highlands as the source of the Blue Nile, completing the broader understanding of the river system. These discoveries transformed maps and reshaped global perceptions of Africa's geography. The search for the Nile's source was more than a quest for knowledge. It was a reflection of humanity's enduring desire to understand the forces that sustain life itself. In uncovering the river's beginnings, explorers revealed not just geography, but the interconnectedness of distant lands bound together by flowing water. In the modern era, the Nile remains a river of life, but it is no longer ruled solely by nature. Today, more than 300 million people depend on its waters, making the Nile one of the most intensively used river systems on Earth. What was once guided by seasonal rhythms is now shaped by engineering, politics, and modern necessity. The most transformative intervention came in the 20th century with the construction of major dams, most notably the Aswan High Dam in Egypt. Completed in 1970, the dam tamed the river's annual floods, provided hydroelectric power, and allowed for year-round irrigation. Lake Nasser, one of the world's largest artificial reservoirs, became a symbol of modern control over an ancient force. Yet control came at a cost. The dam trapped the fertile silt that once renewed farmlands downstream, forcing farmers to rely on artificial fertilizers. Coastal erosion increased as sediment no longer reached the Mediterranean. Ecological balances that had endured for millennia were disrupted within decades. Beyond Egypt, the Nile has become a source of regional tension and cooperation. Countries along its course, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt in particular, depend on its waters for agriculture, energy, and development. The construction of large-scale projects, such as Ethiopia's Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, GERD, has sparked debates over water rights, sovereignty, and shared responsibility. At the same time, the Nile supports modern cities, industries, and trade routes. Urban centers like Cairo, Khartoum, and Jinja thrive along its banks, drawing life and livelihood from the river as their ancient predecessors once did. Today's Nile is a balancing act between tradition and progress, between national interests and regional survival. The challenge of the modern world is no longer how to live with the river's unpredictability, but how to manage its limits without breaking the fragile system that sustains millions. The Nile, once defined by resilience and continuity, now faces unprecedented environmental challenges. Population growth, pollution, climate change, and overexploitation threaten the delicate balance that has sustained the river for thousands of years. Industrial waste, agricultural runoff, and untreated sewage contaminate the water, affecting both ecosystems and human health. Fish populations decline as habitats are altered and water quality deteriorates. Wetlands that once acted as natural filters are drained or reduced, weakening the river's ability to heal itself. Climate change introduces new uncertainty. Rising temperatures increase evaporation, while shifting rainfall patterns in the Ethiopian highlands and Central Africa threaten the reliability of the river's flow. Events that were once predictable, floods and droughts, are becoming increasingly erratic. In response, conservation efforts have emerged across the basin. Regional initiatives aim to promote cooperation among Nile Basin countries, encouraging data sharing, sustainable water use, and long-term planning. Environmental organizations work to restore wetlands, protect biodiversity, and reduce pollution through improved waste management. Local communities play a crucial role in conservation, combining traditional knowledge with modern science to protect the river that sustains them. Education programs emphasize water stewardship, recognizing that the Nile's future depends not only on policy, but on collective responsibility. The fate of the Nile is inseparable from the fate of those who depend on it. Preserving this ancient river is no longer a question of reverence alone. It is a matter of survival, demanding respect, restraint, and cooperation in an age of growing uncertainty. The Nile continues to flow as it has for millions of years, past temples worn smooth by time, through cities alive with movement, and into a future still being written. Its waters carry more than sediment. They carry memory. Every bend holds the echo of a civilization that once listened to the river as both teacher and guardian. For ancient peoples, the Nile was a promise that life could endure in the harshest of landscapes, that balance between humanity and nature was possible. In its predictable rise and fall, they found meaning, order, and hope. Today, that promise remains, but it is no longer guaranteed. The modern world has learned how to control the river, but control is not the same as understanding. Dams, canals, and borders now shape its journey, yet the Nile reminds us that nature's systems are deeply interconnected and easily disrupted. What happens upstream is felt downstream, binding nations together as surely as the river binds its banks. The story of the Nile is not finished. It flows into the future carrying a question as old as civilization itself. Can humanity live in harmony with the forces that sustain it? As long as the Nile runs north toward the sea, it whispers a timeless truth, that survival is not found in domination, but in balance, respect, and shared responsibility. The river endures. The choice now is ours.